The first sign that something had gone seriously sideways in Millbrook County came on a Tuesday morning when Old Deputy Marcus Webb found 3 deer carcasses near Route 9, torn apart like something had gone absolutely nuts on them. Marcus had been working law enforcement for damn near 30 years, seen his share of wild animal attacks and weird stuff that happened out in the backwoods, but this was different. The deer weren't just killed, they were shredded, and whatever did it had eaten maybe 10% of the meat before moving on, like it was searching for something specific, something the venison couldn't satisfy. Marcus radioed it into Sheriff Tommy Bradford, who told him to tag it for animal control and not worry too much about it. Times were already tense enough without starting a panic about rabid bears or whatever the hell might be roaming around their quiet corner of Pennsylvania. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling in his gut, that old cop instinct that told him when something was really wrong. He took photos with his phone, documented everything proper-like, and made a mental note to keep his hunting rifle loaded at home, just in case. Across town, 24-year-old Katie Morrison was pulling a double shift at Millbrook General Hospital, which wasn't really a proper hospital but more like an oversized clinic with delusions of grandeur. She'd been working as an ER nurse for 2 years since graduating, and the job had already aged her beyond her years with the standard parade of farming accidents, car wrecks, and the occasional meth-related disaster that plagued rural communities. But that Tuesday brought something she'd never seen before. A guy named Dale Hutchins came stumbling in around 11 in the morning, looking like death warmed over, his skin this weird grayish color, sweating buckets despite the cool October weather. Dale worked at the meat processing plant on the edge of town, and he kept saying he felt wrong, just wrong, like his body wasn't his anymore. Katie took his vitals and nearly dropped her clipboard when she saw his temperature was barely 94 degrees. Hypothermia didn't make sense given he was dressed fine and hadn't been outside long. His heart rate was all over the place, erratic and weak, and when she looked into his eyes to check his pupils, she saw something that made her blood run cold. His eyes were clouded over, milky, like cataracts had formed in the span of hours. Dr. Richard Patterson came in to examine Dale, looking just as confused as Katie felt, and they admitted him for observation, pumping him full of fluids and antibiotics in case it was some kind of infection they hadn't identified yet. Meanwhile, at Millbrook High School, 17-year-old Tyler Jackson was trying to stay awake during third-period calculus when his best friend, Amanda Rodriguez, passed him a note that said the internet was blowing up with weird stories from cities up and down the East Coast. Amanda was always plugged into social media, her phone practically attached to her hand, and she had a nose for gossip and breaking news. Tyler unfolded the note and read that people were talking about some kind of sickness spreading fast, folks acting crazy, attacks happening in places like Philadelphia and Baltimore. The mainstream news wasn't covering it much yet, just little blurbs about isolated incidents, but on Twitter and Reddit, people were freaking out, sharing videos that looked fake as hell but were supposedly real. Tyler figured it was probably blown out of proportion, the internet doing what it did best, turning a few random crimes into some kind of conspiracy theory. But Amanda seemed genuinely spooked, and she wasn't the type to scare easy. She'd grown up tough, the daughter of immigrants who'd built a life from nothing, and she had this street-smart quality that Tyler respected. If she was worried, maybe there was something to worry about. By Tuesday evening, things started accelerating in ways that nobody could have predicted. Dale Hutchins, the guy who'd come into the hospital that morning, had deteriorated rapidly despite treatment. His temperature had dropped even further, his heartbeat had become barely detectable, and around 6 p.m., he flatlined. Dr. Patterson called it, time of death at 6:14, and Katie Morrison helped prepare the body, feeling this overwhelming sadness for a man who'd been alive and walking just hours ago. They wheeled Dale down to the hospital's tiny morgue, really just a cold storage room in the basement, and Katie went back upstairs to finish her shift. But at 7:30, all hell broke loose. One of the orderlies, a young guy named Chris, came running up from the basement screaming that the dead guy was moving. Katie thought he'd lost his mind, maybe playing a prank in poor taste, but then she heard the crashes coming from downstairs, the sound of equipment being thrown around. Dr. Patterson, Katie, and 2 security guards headed down to check it out, and what they found defied everything Katie had ever learned in nursing school. Dale Hutchins was up and moving, but calling it alive would be generous. He moved with this jerky, uncoordinated gait, his arms reaching out toward them, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to bite the air itself. The cloudy eyes had gotten worse, completely white now, and he was making this sound, this low groaning that didn't sound human. One of the security guards, an older guy named Pete, tried to calm Dale down, approaching with his hands up in a peaceful gesture, but Dale lunged at him with surprising speed. Pete went down hard, and Dale was on him, actually biting Pete's shoulder before the other security guard, a younger buck named Travis, pulled Dale off. It took both Travis and Dr. Patterson to restrain Dale, and even then, he fought with this relentless strength that didn't match his frail appearance. They managed to get him into one of the isolation rooms and locked the door, with Dale throwing himself against it over and over, that groaning never stopping. Pete was bleeding bad from the bite, and Katie immediately started treating him, cleaning the wound, but she could see in Dr. Patterson's eyes that they were in uncharted territory. The doctor got on the phone to the CDC, to state health services, to anyone who might have answers, while Katie tried to keep Pete stable and wondered what the actual hell was happening. News traveled fast in a small town, faster than any virus could spread. By Wednesday morning, everyone in Millbrook had heard some version of what happened at the hospital, stories getting wilder with each retelling. Sheriff Tommy Bradford had his hands full fielding calls from worried citizens, and he posted deputies at the hospital as a precaution. Marcus Webb, still thinking about those torn-up deer, started putting pieces together in his head that he didn't like. He drove out to the meat processing plant where Dale Hutchins had worked, asking around, and found out that Dale had been complaining about feeling sick since Monday, and that he'd cut himself on some equipment over the weekend. The plant manager, a stressed-out woman named Rebecca Lou, mentioned that they'd received a shipment of livestock from a supplier down south, and that a couple of the animals had seemed off, sickly, but they'd processed them anyway because throwing out product meant losing money. Marcus felt that gut feeling intensify. He didn't know much about diseases or science, but he knew cause and effect, and the timeline was starting to form a picture he really didn't want to see. At Millbrook High, Tyler Jackson and Amanda Rodriguez were glued to Amanda's phone during lunch, watching as the story that had been bubbling on social media finally hit the mainstream news. Major networks were reporting outbreaks of violence in at least 8 major cities, with victims displaying symptoms that sounded a whole lot like what had happened to Dale Hutchins. The authorities were calling it a new form of encephalitis, a brain infection that caused extreme aggression and psychosis, but the videos being shared online told a different story. People were seeing the infected get shot multiple times and keep coming, were seeing them attack with single-minded determination, were seeing the bite victims get sick and turn into the same kind of monsters. The word zombie was being thrown around, mostly as a joke or a reference point, but Tyler could see that some folks were starting to wonder if maybe the joke wasn't so funny. Amanda's mom called her during lunch, speaking rapid-fire Spanish, telling her to come home right away. Amanda argued that school wasn't over yet, but her mom wasn't having it, and Tyler could hear the fear in Mrs. Rodriguez's voice even through the phone. Amanda grabbed her stuff and took off, leaving Tyler sitting there with a half-eaten sandwich and a growing sense that normal life was about to become a memory. By Wednesday afternoon, Millbrook General Hospital was dealing with a nightmare scenario. Pete, the security guard who'd been bitten by Dale Hutchins, had developed symptoms matching Dale's almost exactly. His temperature dropped, his skin went gray, and he became increasingly unresponsive before finally dying around 2 p.m. Dr. Patterson, knowing what had happened with Dale, ordered Pete's body restrained before he could reanimate, strapping him to a gurney in the isolation room. Sure enough, 15 minutes after being pronounced dead, Pete came back, thrashing against the restraints with that same mindless aggression. Katie Morrison stood outside the isolation room, watching through the window, her hands shaking as she tried to process what she was seeing. This wasn't a disease, not in any conventional sense. This was people dying and coming back wrong, coming back as something that wanted to hurt, to bite, to spread whatever this was to everyone they could reach. Dr. Patterson was on the phone with the CDC again, his voice getting louder and more frustrated as whoever was on the other end apparently tried to feed him bureaucratic nonsense instead of real help. The CDC was aware of the situation and sending teams, but that didn't help them right now, didn't tell them how to treat this or stop it. Sheriff Tommy Bradford got the call from the hospital about Pete around 2:30, and he made the decision to shut down Route 9, the main highway that connected Millbrook to the bigger towns and cities. If this thing was spreading through bites like everyone was starting to suspect, then limiting traffic in and out of Millbrook might slow it down. Marcus Webb thought it was a smart move, though maybe too late. He'd been monitoring the police scanner and had heard reports from neighboring counties that sounded bad, real bad. There were incidents popping up all over, small at first but growing, and the pattern was always the same: someone acting sick, someone attacking others, bite victims getting infected. The state police were overwhelmed, the National Guard was being mobilized, and the governor was talking about quarantine zones. Marcus went home Wednesday evening and told his wife, Lynn, that they needed to prepare for the worst. Lynn had been a school teacher for 25 years and had seen Marcus worry before, but never like this. They loaded up on canned goods from the pantry, filled every container they had with water, and Marcus checked all his firearms, making sure everything was cleaned and loaded. Their daughter, Jennifer, lived in Pittsburgh with her husband and kids, and Marcus tried calling her a dozen times but couldn't get through. The cell networks were getting jammed with everyone trying to reach their loved ones at once. Tyler Jackson's parents were the practical type, the kind of folks who'd lived through economic downturns and bad winters and came out okay because they planned ahead. Tyler's dad, Robert, worked in construction and had the kind of hands-on skills that people undervalued until things went south. His mom, Patricia, was a paralegal who believed in preparation and keeping a level head. When Tyler got home from school on Wednesday, both his parents were already there, which was unusual, and the TV was on, showing news coverage of what was being called the outbreak. Robert had already started boarding up the ground floor windows, and Patricia was going through their emergency supplies, making lists of what they had and what they might need. Tyler's younger sister, Emily, who was 14 and usually glued to her tablet, was actually helping without being asked, which showed how serious things felt. Robert gathered the family in the living room and laid it out plain: something bad was spreading, people were getting violent and sick, and until they knew more, the Jacksons were going to hunker down and stay safe. Tyler thought about Amanda, hoped she was okay with her family, and sent her a text that didn't go through because the networks were finally starting to fail. By Thursday morning, Millbrook was a town on the edge of panic. The local news station, really just a two-person operation that usually covered school board meetings and county fairs, was reporting that the National Guard had set up checkpoints on all major roads, and that governor's orders were for everyone to shelter in place. The hospitals in the bigger cities were overrun, and there were reports of facilities being abandoned as the infected overwhelmed security and staff. Millbrook General had closed its doors to new patients, and Dr. Patterson had made the controversial call to keep Dale Hutchins and Pete restrained in isolation rather than putting them down, which is what some folks were saying needed to happen. Katie Morrison had barely slept, living on coffee and adrenaline, and she was starting to see the ethical nightmare unfolding. These things, these reanimated corpses, they weren't people anymore, not really, but they wore the faces of people they'd known, and ending them felt like murder even if keeping them around was dangerous. The situation went from bad to catastrophic when the power grid started failing Thursday afternoon. The outbreak had hit the major cities hardest, and the infrastructure that kept places like Millbrook running depended on those cities. Workers didn't show up to power plants, technicians couldn't maintain systems, and the whole network started to collapse in a cascade of failures. Millbrook lost electricity around 3 p.m., and with it went the illusion of normalcy. Without power, the hospital was running on generators that had maybe 48 hours of fuel. Without power, people couldn't get news except from battery-powered radios, couldn't charge phones, couldn't keep food cold. Sheriff Bradford opened up the old community center as a shelter for folks who didn't have good options, and volunteers started organizing, pooling resources, trying to keep order. Marcus Webb, working overtime along with the other deputies, noticed that people were splitting into two camps, those who were scared but trying to work together, and those who were so scared they were only looking out for themselves. He'd seen it before in smaller crises, but never like this, never with stakes this high. Tyler Jackson spent Thursday helping his dad reinforce their house, learning how to board windows properly, how to create barriers that might actually hold against someone trying to break in. Robert didn't say it out loud, but Tyler understood they weren't just worried about the infected anymore. They were worried about neighbors who might get desperate, about looters, about the breakdown of law and order that happened when people stopped believing anyone was coming to help. Patricia had been trying to get information on the radio, spinning the dial through static until she found broadcasts from emergency stations. The news was universally bad. Philadelphia was lost, the entire city overrun with the infected roaming the streets in growing numbers. New York was holding on in pockets, the bridges and tunnels bombed to prevent the spread, but the infection was already there, already spreading through the boroughs. Washington, D.C. had been evacuated, the government relocating to secure facilities, which felt like the ultimate abandonment, the people who were supposed to protect everyone just running away. Emily started crying when she heard that, and Patricia held her, whispering reassurances that Tyler wasn't sure either of them believed. Amanda Rodriguez and her family were dealing with their own struggles across town. Her father, Carlos, worked in maintenance and had the same kind of practical skills as Tyler's dad, and he'd fortified their small house as best he could. But the Rodriguez family had extended relatives who'd been staying with them, cousins who'd been visiting from New Jersey when the outbreak hit and now couldn't get home. There were 8 people crammed into a 3-bedroom house, and supplies that might have lasted one family a couple of weeks would go much faster with more mouths to feed. Amanda's mom, Rosa, was trying to keep everyone calm, cooking meals that stretched ingredients, leading prayers that Amanda found both comforting and frustrating because prayers didn't stop the dead from walking. Amanda kept thinking about Tyler, hoping he was safe, wishing she could talk to him. Their friendship had always been solid, built on years of shared classes and inside jokes, and she realized that not knowing if he was okay was almost worse than the fear of the infected themselves. Friday brought the first infected to Millbrook proper. A family driving up from Maryland, trying to escape the outbreak in Baltimore, had stopped at the gas station on Route 9 before the roadblocks went up fully. One of them had been bitten, had hidden it, and by Friday morning, they'd turned. The gas station attendant, a kid named Josh Parker who was barely 20, got attacked when he opened up the store. Josh managed to fight off the infected woman and barricade himself in the back office, calling 911 in a panic. Sheriff Bradford, Marcus Webb, and 2 other deputies responded, and they arrived to find the infected woman pounding on the office door with relentless determination, her fingers bloody from the effort, pieces of flesh torn off from the impacts. Marcus had his service weapon drawn, and he knew what needed to happen, but actually pulling the trigger on what looked like a middle-aged soccer mom was harder than he'd expected. Bradford made the call, nodding to Marcus, and Marcus took the shot. It took 3 bullets, 2 to the chest that barely slowed her down, and then 1 to the head that finally dropped her for good. They found the rest of her family in the car at the gas pumps, all turned, including 2 kids who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. The deputies had to put them all down, and Marcus threw up afterward, losing his breakfast in the bushes behind the gas station while his hands shook so bad he could barely holster his weapon. The reality of headshots being necessary spread through Millbrook like wildfire, and folks who'd been on the fence about the zombie label weren't laughing anymore. If you had to shoot someone in the head to stop them, and they kept coming after bullets to the body, then whatever you wanted to call them, they were something out of a horror movie. The community center shelter became a hub for information and organization, with Sheriff Bradford and a group of level-headed citizens forming a council to make decisions. They had maybe 200 people at the shelter, plus several hundred more in their homes, and they needed a plan. A guy named Vincent Hayes, who'd been an Army medic before retiring to Millbrook, stepped up as a voice of reason and experience. Vincent had seen combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, and while he'd never faced anything like reanimated corpses, he understood tactics, understood how to organize people and resources under pressure. He proposed that Millbrook needed to think of itself as an island, cut off from outside help, and plan accordingly. Katie Morrison left the hospital Friday evening, after Dr. Patterson finally admitted that staying there was a losing battle. The generators were running low on fuel, they had no way to get more supplies, and the 2 infected they were keeping in isolation were a constant danger. Patterson made the hardest call of his career and euthanized Dale Hutchins and Pete himself, injections that stopped their reanimated functions, ending what they'd become. He and Katie and the remaining skeleton crew then joined the community center shelter, bringing what medical supplies they could carry. Katie found herself being looked to as a medical expert, which felt overwhelming given that she was a nurse, not a doctor, and had no experience with anything like this. But Dr. Patterson reassured her that her practical skills and calm demeanor were exactly what people needed, and that they'd figure it out together. Tyler Jackson made his way to the community center Saturday morning, with his dad's permission, because Robert recognized that sitting in their house listening to bad news on the radio was driving them all crazy. Tyler needed to see other people, needed to feel like he was doing something useful, and Robert figured the community center was safe enough with the sheriff's people there. Tyler found the place buzzing with activity, people organizing supplies, setting up sleeping areas, establishing security shifts. He ran into Amanda there, and the relief on both their faces was obvious. They hugged, maybe longer than was strictly necessary, and then Amanda pulled him aside to show him what she'd been working on. A group of the younger folks had been tasked with creating an inventory system, tracking who had what skills, what supplies existed and where, basically building a database of everything Millbrook had to work with. Amanda, with her social media savvy and organizational mind, had taken the lead, and Tyler jumped in to help, grateful for something concrete to focus on. Vincent Hayes organized a security team made up of anyone with military, police, or hunting experience, plus volunteers who were willing to learn. Marcus Webb became the second in command, with Sheriff Bradford overseeing law and order while Marcus handled the tactical training. They had maybe 40 people who knew how to shoot, and weapons ranging from hunting rifles to handguns to a couple of AR-15s that folks had owned legally. Vincent ran drills on headshots, on conservation of ammunition, on creating kill zones and fallback positions. He was blunt about their situation: they had limited ammo, limited resources, and potentially unlimited enemies if the infected kept spreading. Their only advantages were organization, intelligence, and the defensive position of Millbrook itself. The town was surrounded by farmland and forests, with only a few main roads in, which could be blocked and defended. If they were smart and careful, they could make Millbrook a fortress. But not everyone was on board with the community approach. There were folks who thought the shelter was a death trap waiting to happen, too many people in one place, a target for the infected or for desperate outsiders. A local businessman named Greg Tolliver, who owned a sporting goods store and had access to a lot of outdoor gear, started his own group, taking over an old warehouse on the edge of town. Greg's philosophy was survival of the fittest, only let in people who brought something valuable, and trust no one from outside. About 50 people joined up with Greg, creating a split in the community that made Marcus Webb nervous. Unity was their strength, and dividing resources and people weakened everyone. But Sheriff Bradford, ever the peacekeeper, tried to maintain friendly relations with Greg's group, sharing information and staying on speaking terms, hoping that if things got really bad, they could still work together. The first big test came Sunday evening. A horde of infected, maybe 60 or 70 strong, came shambling up Route 9 from the south, drawn by noise or smell or whatever twisted instinct drove them. The barricade that had been set up on the highway became a battleground as Vincent's security team engaged. The sound of gunfire echoed through Millbrook, and Tyler, Amanda, and the others at the community center could only listen and wait, helping to prepare medical supplies and extra ammunition for runners to take out to the fight. Marcus Webb was on the front line, his hunting rifle dropping infected with precise headshots, but the sheer number of them was terrifying. For every one that fell, 2 more shuffled forward, stepping over the bodies, groaning that inhuman groan. They were men, women, teenagers, elderly, all ages and types, united only in their drive to reach the living. Some were fresh, recently turned with minimal damage, while others were torn up, missing limbs or chunks of flesh, but still moving, still dangerous. The security team held the line, barely, going through ammunition at a rate that made Vincent curse under his breath. They dropped 40 of the infected before the rest finally wandered off, their attention drawn elsewhere by sounds in the forest. The team had 3 injuries, people who'd been grabbed or knocked down but fortunately not bitten, and they were running at about 60% ammunition capacity. Vincent called a meeting afterward and laid out the hard truth: they couldn't sustain many more fights like that. They needed to be smarter, use traps and barriers, make the infected come to them in controlled ways where they could be dealt with efficiently. Marcus suggested adapting hunting techniques, creating funnels and choke points, using noise to direct the infected where they wanted them to go. It was grim work, discussing the undead like they were deer during hunting season, but it was necessary. Katie Morrison treated the injured from the barricade fight, cleaning cuts and bruises, checking for bites with a thoroughness that bordered on paranoia. Everyone understood now that a bite was a death sentence, and Katie had to make a policy that anyone bitten would be quarantined immediately. It was brutal, condemning people before they were even symptomatic, but the alternative was allowing the infection to get inside their defenses. Dr. Patterson backed her up, and Sheriff Bradford made it official: bites meant quarantine, no exceptions, and if someone turned, they'd be put down quickly and humanely. The policy sat heavy on everyone's conscience, but nobody could argue with the necessity. Tyler and Amanda, working on the inventory lists, started to see patterns in what Millbrook had and didn't have. They had decent medical supplies thanks to the hospital and local pharmacies. They had okay food stocks, maybe 3 months if rationed carefully. They had winter approaching, which meant they needed heating solutions without electricity, which meant wood stoves and fireplaces, which meant cutting and storing wood. They had water from wells in the creek that ran through town, but they'd need to boil it or purify it without modern systems. They had fuel for vehicles and generators, but it would run out eventually. Tyler realized that they were looking at a long-term survival situation, not a temporary crisis. This wasn't going to be over in a week or a month. The world had changed, fundamentally, and Millbrook would have to change with it or die. Amanda brought up the idea of reaching out to other communities, trying to establish contact and maybe trade or share information. The radios still worked, at least the CB and ham radios that didn't rely on cell towers, and there were a few folks in Millbrook who were ham radio enthusiasts. An older gentleman named Walter Kowalski had a whole setup in his basement, and he'd been listening to broadcasts from around the region. Walter reported that there were pockets of survivors everywhere, some organized like Millbrook, others just people huddled together hoping for rescue. The government broadcasts had stopped around Saturday, which was ominous as hell, suggesting that either the government had fallen or had retreated so far into secure bunkers that they were abandoning the public. Military channels were sporadic, with some units still fighting, others gone silent. Walter had made contact with a group in a town about 50 miles west, comparing notes, and the situation was similar everywhere: isolated communities trying to survive, surrounded by the infected, no help coming. The second week of the outbreak brought a brutal routine to Millbrook. Days were spent on security patrols, scavenging runs to abandoned homes and stores, maintenance of barricades and defenses. Nights were the worst, with the infected more active after dark, their groaning carrying across the quiet town, putting everyone on edge. Sleep became precious and elusive, with nightmares plaguing those who managed to doze off. Tyler found himself becoming numb to things that would have horrified him 2 weeks ago: the sight of corpses being burned in mass pyres, the sound of gunshots that meant infected were being put down, the hollow look in people's eyes as hope became a scarce resource. But there were also moments of unexpected humanity. Rosa Rodriguez organized a communal kitchen at the shelter, and the smell of her cooking became a comfort, a reminder of normalcy. Robert Jackson led work crews in repairing and fortifying structures, teaching skills to anyone willing to learn. Patricia Jackson started a school for the kids, because even in the apocalypse, children needed routine and education and a sense of future. Emily Jackson, Tyler's sister, became friends with some of the other younger kids, and their laughter, rare as it was, reminded everyone what they were fighting for. Vincent Hayes ran daily training sessions, and Marcus Webb was amazed at how quickly people learned when their lives depended on it. Folks who'd never held a gun became decent shots. People learned hand-to-hand combat, how to use melee weapons effectively for when ammunition ran out. They practiced formations, communication signals, emergency protocols. Millbrook was becoming a militia, a community of survivors who refused to just roll over and die. Katie Morrison and Dr. Patterson established a clinic area in the shelter, treating everything from infections to injuries to the mental health struggles that were affecting everyone. Katie found herself doing triage not just on bodies but on minds, talking people through panic attacks and despair, becoming a counselor as much as a nurse. Sheriff Bradford and Greg Tolliver maintained their uneasy alliance, with the warehouse group and the shelter group cooperating on major security issues but remaining separate in daily operations. Marcus didn't like the division, but he had to admit that Greg's group had fortified the warehouse impressively, creating a genuine stronghold that could serve as a fallback position if the shelter was ever overrun. The two groups shared intelligence about infected movements and occasionally traded supplies, maintaining a functional if not warm relationship. Tyler and Amanda grew closer through the shared trauma, their friendship deepening into something more though neither of them quite acknowledged it out loud. They worked side by side every day, and Amanda's optimism, battered but still present, became something Tyler relied on. She had this way of finding silver linings, of pointing out small victories, that kept him from sliding into the darkness that threatened to consume everyone. When they got a ham radio message from a survivor group 2 states over who were actually doing okay, who'd cleared their area and were rebuilding, Amanda grabbed Tyler's hand and squeezed it, her eyes bright with tears, and said, "See? It's possible. We can make it." And Tyler believed her, or at least wanted to badly enough that it amounted to the same thing. The third week brought the first real cold snap, October sliding into November with frost in the mornings and the promise of a hard winter. The community center shelter became cramped as people tried to stay warm, and the wood-gathering teams worked overtime to stockpile fuel for fires. Vincent and Marcus led a major scavenging expedition to a town 15 miles away, taking a convoy of trucks and 20 armed people, hoping to find supplies before other survivors or the infected stripped everything. They found the town mostly empty, with signs of violence and exodus, but they also found a hardware store intact and a pharmacy that hadn't been completely looted. They loaded up on antibiotics, pain meds, vitamins, tools, nails, batteries, and a dozen other necessities, and they made it back to Millbrook without losing anyone, which felt like a miracle. Katie Morrison, during a quiet moment in the clinic, broke down crying, the stress of 3 weeks finally cracking her composure. Dr. Patterson sat with her, and they talked about the ethical nightmares they were living through, the people they couldn't save, the impossible choices. But Patterson reminded her that they'd also saved lives, that dozens of people were alive because of her skill and dedication, and that in a world gone to hell, being able to say that was everything. Katie wiped her eyes, drank some water, and got back to work, because work was all any of them had, the only thing standing between survival and collapse. Sheriff Bradford called a town meeting, everyone gathered in and around the community center, and he gave the kind of speech that Tyler would remember for the rest of his life. Bradford talked about how Millbrook had always been a town that looked out for its own, how they'd weathered economic troubles and storms and hard times before. This was harder, no question, the hardest thing any of them would ever face. But they were still here, still standing, and that meant something. He talked about the folks who'd died, remembering them by name, honoring them. He talked about the folks who were stepping up, becoming leaders and heroes when they'd never asked for that role. And he talked about hope, about the fact that every day they survived was a day closer to figuring out how to live in this new world. He reminded them that humanity had survived plagues and wars and disasters throughout history, and that Millbrook could be part of that survival story if they chose to be. It wasn't a fancy speech, Bradford wasn't a fancy guy, but it was honest and heartfelt, and people felt it. Tyler watched his neighbors, really looked at them, and saw the choice being made in real time. Some people were choosing fear, huddling in their corners, preparing to die. But more, so many more, were choosing hope. They were choosing to believe that tomorrow could be better than today, that their actions mattered, that community and cooperation could overcome even the dead rising. Rosa Rodriguez stood up and started singing, an old hymn in Spanish, and others joined in, the melody rising in the cold evening air. Tyler wasn't religious, not really, but the sound of those voices, defiant and beautiful, moved something in him. Amanda was singing, her voice blending with her mother's, and Tyler found himself humming along, part of something bigger than himself. Vincent Hayes, the practical soldier, took the momentum from Bradford's speech and turned it into action. He proposed a long-term plan, expand their secure perimeter gradually, clearing buildings block by block, creating a safe zone that could sustain them indefinitely. Set up renewable food sources, gardens and greenhouses and even livestock if they could manage it. Establish regular contact with other survivor communities, build a network of mutual support. Send out scouts to learn the patterns of the infected, where they gathered, where they migrated, how to avoid or eliminate them. Stop thinking about surviving day to day and start thinking about building a future. It was ambitious, maybe crazy, but the alternative was just waiting to die, and Millbrook had already decided that wasn't acceptable. The council that had formed around Sheriff Bradford formalized itself, with Vincent handling military and security, Marcus as his second, Katie and Dr. Patterson handling medical, Robert Jackson leading construction and engineering, Patricia Jackson running education and mental health services, Walter Kowalski managing communications, and several others overseeing food, water, and resource allocation. Even Greg Tolliver from the warehouse group agreed to send a representative, a woman named Michelle Stone who was level-headed and pragmatic. The council met daily, making decisions, solving problems, adapting to whatever new crisis emerged. It wasn't perfect, there were arguments and disagreements, but it was democratic and functional, which was more than most places could claim. Tyler and Amanda, as the youngest members of the extended leadership group, became symbols of the future everyone was trying to build. They took their inventory work and expanded it into a full resource management system, knowing where every bullet, every can of food, every medical supply was located. They helped organize the education programs for kids, making sure Emily and the others had structure and learning. They volunteered for patrols and work details, proving that youth didn't mean uselessness. And they held on to each other, sometimes literally, when the weight of it all felt too heavy. The infected remained a constant threat, with small groups encountered regularly and larger hordes dealt with weekly. But Millbrook got better at handling them, learning that noise discipline kept them away, that barriers and traps could thin their numbers, that coordinated headshots from experienced shooters could clear a dozen infected with minimal ammunition expenditure. The kill count became a grim scoreboard, hundreds of infected put down in the first month, their bodies burned to prevent disease. Marcus Webb stopped flinching at the headshots, stopped seeing people and started seeing targets, which bothered him in quiet moments but was necessary for survival. A breakthrough came when Dr. Patterson, working with samples in a microscope he'd salvaged, discovered that the infection seemed to be a hybrid of virus and parasite, something that attacked the brainstem and kept basic motor functions active after death. He couldn't develop a cure, didn't have the equipment or expertise, but understanding the mechanism helped them predict how it spread and how to prevent it. Bites were the main vector, but infected blood and open wounds could also transmit it, which meant everyone needed to be careful when putting down infected. Patterson documented everything, hoping that someday someone with better resources could use his notes. As November deepened and the first snows fell, Millbrook settled into its new reality. The world outside remained chaotic and dark, but inside their perimeter, there was light, warmth, community. They celebrated Thanksgiving in the shelter, pooling resources for a feast that was modest but meaningful. Rosa Rodriguez cooked turkey from the local farm, and others contributed what they could, and for one evening, They weren't just survivors, they were a family. Sheriff Bradford said grace, thanking God or fate or whatever force had brought them together and kept them alive. People cried, remembering those who were gone, but they also laughed, sharing stories and jokes, reclaiming their humanity. Tyler sat next to Amanda, their shoulders touching, and he realized that despite everything, despite the horror and loss, he wasn't entirely unhappy. He had purpose, he had friends, he had a community worth fighting for. Amanda caught him looking at her and smiled, that bright smile that had survived the apocalypse, and Tyler smiled back. They were young, they were scared, but they were alive and they were choosing hope. Around them, Millbrook was making the same choice, one person at a time, one day at a time. The infected were out there, the world had fallen, but here, in this small Pennsylvania town, people were building something new from the ruins. They were proving that even when the dead rose, the living could rise higher. They were becoming not just survivors, but a community with a future, and that future started with the simple, powerful choice to keep going, to keep hoping, to keep being human when everything pushed them to become monsters. Winter would be hard, and the struggles were far from over, but Millbrook would endure, because they'd decided together that giving up wasn't an option. The unseen threat had risen from the shadows, but so had something equally powerful, the unbreakable spirit of people who refused to let fear win. And in that refusal, in that choice of hope over despair, they found not just survival, but meaning, purpose, and the foundation for whatever came next.